Join us in a festival that promises to be extraordinary, because Bali is extraordinary.
Hi everyone, welcome to Ubud Writers and Readers Festival 2021. This year, the festival returns with the theme Mulat Sarira, Self-Reflection, which is drawn from the Balinese Hindu philosophy. The festival, taking place from 8th to 17th of October, explores the meaning of self-reflection, cultural introspection, and human rights. It also examines who we are, what unites and divides us, and what drives our action. I sincerely thank each and every one of you for supporting our festival. I'm indebted to many people who have made the Ubud Writers and Readers Festival possible. So my name is Nguyen Phan Que Mai, author of The Mountains Sing. I'm so excited to bring you today's session, What It Means to Be a Refugee, via my conversation with Professor Viet Thanh Nguyen. Professor Viet Nguyen is a refugee from Vietnam, arriving in the United States at the end of the Vietnam War when he was 4 years old. He has overcome many challenges to become one of the most important writers and thinkers of our times. His debut novel, The Sympathizer, is the winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and many other prestigious awards. It is being adapted into an HBO series. The novel's sequel, The Committed, is such an action-packed, fun, innovative, and important novel. Professor Viet Nguyen is also an award-winning critic, and all of us can learn from his non-fiction books, such as Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, Race and Resistance, Literature, Politics, and Asian America. His other books include the short story collection, The Refugees, and the children's book, Chicken of the Sea, which he wrote with his 6-year-old son, Allison. He regularly contributes his opinions on the New York Times and the Time magazine. Professor Viet Thanh Nguyen, thank you so much for being with us today. So you wrote a very moving piece on the Financial Times in which you said, I'm a refugee, an American, and a human being, which is important to proclaim, as there are many who think these identities cannot be reconciled. So towards the end of the Vietnam War, when you were just 4 years old, your mother took you, your 10-year-old brother, and walked 184 kilometers from Ban Mae Thuột to the nearest port in Nha Trang, Vietnam. You escaped very difficult circumstances before arriving in the United States, where you were separated from your parents for a while. You have triumphed over many challenges to become the role model for many of us. So could you tell us what being a refugee means to you personally, and how has it been affecting your life and your creative work?
Well, hi, Que Mai. First of all, I just want to say I'm delighted to be able to talk to you in front of this audience. Such a pleasure, especially speaking to a novelist and a poet whose work I really admire. The refugee question, it's an important one, because so much of my identity is wrapped up in this refugee history. I wouldn't be where I am today as an American and as a writer, if it weren't for the war in Vietnam and then for the circumstances that forced my family to flee as refugees, becoming a refugee, I don't think it's anything anybody wants to become, but for those of us who have been through that experience, I think it's an unforgettable experience. We may try to put it behind us. We may try to call ourselves by different names, such as immigrants or citizens, but for me, I always remain being a refugee. And what that means for me is that I'm constantly aware of what it means to be displaced, what it means to be an other, what it means to seek out hospitality. And I feel that there's an obligation there for refugees, for those of us who have been welcomed, who have been helped, who have been given a chance. It's our obligation to extend those benefits to other people. So it's important for those of us who have been refugees to talk about that experience and to promote the idea that nations and communities all over the world need to be hospitable to refugees. And of course, I'm thinking about this because of the end of the war in Afghanistan, which has created many new refugees. And of course, the obligation is there for Americans and for other Western countries to receive and to help as many Afghan refugees as possible. And finally, I think what I've been talking about in terms of the necessity for empathy, for example, extended to other people once you've been an other yourself, that's also really crucial to what it means to be a writer. That to be a writer means one of our basic tools is to be empathetic. And I think I've learned a lot about empathy from being a refugee and thinking about the situation of others.
Oh, this is amazing and important to hear, because I think our world needs more compassion and more empathy, and I'm really grateful for the work you have done, not just as a writer, but also as an advocate and activist for refugees. So, during the first part of our conversation, I like to focus on your creative work, and later on I like to ask you more about the work that we can all do together for refugees. So normally refugees are seen as victims, as those who are poor and pitiful, as those who need to be rescued. So you write against these stereotypes and have portrayed refugees as very complex human beings. So in your novels, The Sympathizer and The Committed, your refugee narrator is a victim of evil acts, but he also committed a lot of evil acts himself. He speaks and writes better English than Americans. He brings down the colonizers by criticizing and making fun of them. He's one of the most outrageous, intelligent, well-educated, and sophisticated characters I have read. So what did it take for you to be able to come up with such a unique character like the captain, whose name was revealed as Vô Danh, or no name, in the second novel, The Committed? Why do you think it's important to represent refugees as complex human beings and as those who are often forgotten or brushed aside?
So I think it's true that refugees are often depicted as being people desperately in need of help and therefore being pathetic. And that is true in one sense. Obviously, refugees do need help. And in the circumstances of being forced from their homes by war or famine or other kinds of catastrophes, they're kind of pathetic. But this obscures so many other issues. Number one, when we talk about refugees being in need of rescue, we often obscure the fact that we are often responsible for creating the conditions that turn people into refugees. Now, when I'm talking specifically about the United States, the United States intervention in Vietnam helped to produce the circumstances that led to hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese people fleeing as refugees. The United States intervening in Afghanistan led to the conditions for hundreds of thousands of people fleeing as refugees from Afghanistan. And Americans who then put forth a narrative of, oh, let's help and rescue these poor, pitiful refugees, obscure their own responsibility in creating these conditions. So I think that's very important to recognize. The second issue is that, yes, refugees are desperate and pathetic and all of that, but they're also heroic. Imagine what it takes to uproot your entire life, to take yourself or your family and undertake a journey that you know can possibly lead to the deaths of everyone you love. And we were talking about Vietnamese people. We know that that was true, that hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese people chose to flee by sea in the 1970s and early 1980s, and they knew that their odds of survival were really poor. Now, why would we call these people desperate and pathetic instead of heroic, which is what we would call them if these refugees were white people portrayed in a white representation? So the role of someone like you or me as artists is to draw attention to the subjectivity, the history, the experiences, the emotions of people like this by looking at the world from their perspective. And from their perspective, yes, they're desperate, or we are desperate, but we are also doing things that if we were to narrate our own experiences would be, again, heroic or tragic or comic. And that's the ambition behind the novels that I've written. I've met a lot of Vietnamese refugees who I think are very complicated, sophisticated people. You know, they've carved out whole lives and careers for themselves in Vietnam. And then because of their refugee circumstances are forced to flee to the United States or other countries where they're reduced in American eyes to being people who speak English poorly, for example, who are working lower tier jobs because that's the only thing that they're allowed to do in the United States. And their whole sense of validation and who they are is vastly diminished in the eyes of people who don't understand them. So again, in the Sympathizer, I wanted to create a character who I thought might exist in the Vietnamese diaspora, because why not? If I had written this novel about a white person, for example, no one would blink an eye. Of course, white people can do all the things that the Sympathizer does. But if white people can do that, Vietnamese people surely can as well, or any other person, any other population. And so this is one of the great magical abilities of literature, you know, that you or I or anybody else can write this kind of a story. All it takes is our time, our feelings, our energy, our lives. It's quite unlike making a movie, which requires millions of dollars. So I thought, I can write this story. It's in my power to do it. And let's go ahead and let's create a novel wherein Vietnamese people are at the center and are as fully complex as everybody else is. And finally, the last note there is, when I say fully complex, I mean not just being human and being lovable and sympathetic and all that, but also being inhuman. That for me, part of what it means to be human is to be so complex that you're capable of doing terrible things as well and not being demonized as a result. We know that this is what human beings do, that human beings are capable of the full range of emotions and possibilities. And that's what these novels that I've written try to do. And I think your work does that as well.
You know, you created the captain or Vô Giang, you know, as a fictional character, but he's so real to me. And sometimes he's so real that sometimes, you know, when I encounter something and I would think, what could the captain say about this? How could he make fun of the situation? And it's an incredible achievement. And you know, when I read the opening section about, you know, the captain being on a boat together with other refugees and trying to survive the terrible voyage, I was thinking about my childhood when I was living in Vietnam. And, you know, some of my friends would disappear from my class. They were unable to, you know, to tell us that they would be leaving us to go and seek another life somewhere. And I was really scared for them. And I remember, you know, listening in secret with my brother to Voice of America radio program because it was forbidden at that time in Vietnam. And I do think that those people who were brave enough to leave everything behind, to embark on such a risky journey, they are heroes, you know. So I'm really thankful that you have written these amazing novels and many books, and your work is most influential to me, and you have changed the publishing landscape, you know. For example, by your position as a minority writer, and you have said writers from the minority write as if you are the majority. Do not explain, do not cater, do not translate, do not apologize. Can you explain why you have set out to offend a lot of people, not just white people, but our own Vietnamese people as well with your writing, and what have you achieved in that process?
And sometimes I thought about what it would be for me, what it would be like for me if I had never left Vietnam and if I had become a writer in Vietnam. Now, if that was the case, I would not have to translate. I would be writing in Vietnamese and my audience would be Vietnamese people, and therefore there would be no necessity for translation. I could assume that we would share an entire universe together of food, customs, history, et cetera, and that I could just write a story and take an enormous number of things for granted. Now, in the United States, where I live, that's true also for Americans, especially white Americans. White Americans who write fiction, for example, can take for granted that most of their audience will know exactly what they're talking about, and they do. Even me, who is not white, knows pretty much most of what white people are saying because I've grown up in this country. I've been forced to, and it's been an absolute necessity for me to know very astutely and with every nuance what white people think, how they represent themselves, what kind of literature they write, what kind of movies they make, and so on and so forth. So I'm the eavesdropper in the United States on what white people say and do. And I accept that position. And I don't expect white people to translate to me, right? So when I became a writer as an Asian American, Vietnamese American writer, writer of color, minority writer, whatever term you want to put on me, and I accept all those terms, I thought what was really crucial is that I should do the same thing that white people do, which is to write without translation, to write with the expectation that people would understand what I have to say. And I think that's an absolutely crucial artistic, political, psychological move that all of us who are classified in one way or another as a so-called minority writer should be undertaking. Because if we decide, well, my audience may not understand what I'm saying, so I should translate this term, this word, I should explain this custom, I should explain this history I'm referencing, we are already putting ourselves in a position of weakness and of apology and of acknowledging that our audience is not like us. And that is, again, a real aesthetic, political, and psychological weakness that people who are classified as minority need to recognize and overcome, because I think it really deforms the literature and the art that we make. And so in a novel like The Sympathizer and then like in The Committed, I wrote as if, number one, my audience was me, and number two, my audience was other Vietnamese people who would know what I'm talking about, and that anybody else, white or otherwise, would have to listen in and eavesdrop, as I have eavesdropped in on the conversations and literature and art of dominant people of the dominant society. And that was very liberating for me as a writer, and judging from the reactions of some readers, liberating for some of my readers. Now, you mentioned that some people get offended. Well, that's true. Yeah, I did set out to offend everybody in writing The Sympathizer and The Committed, Vietnamese, French, Americans, the Vietnamese of all different kinds of backgrounds. And the reason why I set out to try to offend everybody is that these novels are entertainments, they're thrillers, but they're also very political. And one of the political points that they're making is that every ideology, every set of political beliefs is vulnerable to corruption, hypocrisy, abuse, and exploitation. Not just the ideologies and beliefs of our enemies, but our own ideologies and beliefs, the ones of our friends and the people who are around us. And that people have a very hard time accepting. It's very easy to point to someone else's ideology and say, that's flawed. Very easy to point to the enemy and say, they're being hypocritical, they're abusing power. But looking at yourself in your own society, very difficult for a lot of people to do. So I point that out for all these different groups. And therefore, there are people from each group who get offended because very few people like being shown their society's own hypocrisy. But I think that's part of the obligation that writers have, is to speak truth to every situation, not just to the ones that are advantageous to us.
I really admire your work greatly because of your bravery and the insightful ways you have also, looked at the Vietnamese situation and what we have done to each other, and how we contradict ourselves. For example, in The Committed, why the captain acknowledges that Vietnam hates Vietnamese people hate the French for colonizing us, but we love many aspects of French culture as well. We love being colonized in some of the ways. And I think it's really fun to be able to reflect and look at that, because normally, we want to bring the best out of our own community, right? We want to show that, we belong to a good group of people. And I really love the fact that you highlight some of the not so good things that our community or our own people have done. So I have really appreciated that. And it has really influenced my own writing as well. So to come back to the topic of being minority writers. So minorities writers like ourselves are expected to write about our own experiences, whereas in your fiction you have proven that you are an artist capable of creating completely fictional stories removed from your real life experiences. So in an interview you did with Ruby Permuter, you said majority audiences already tend to expect minority writers to be historians and sociologists of their particular minority conditions, as well as translators of that condition. Could you comment on how you push back against the expectations to write what you know?
Sure. And the answer to this is related to the previous answer about writing like the majority. If you're a writer of the majority, especially in the United States or France or other Western countries with liberal democracies, if you offend people, that's to be expected. That's what writers are supposed to do, or at least some set of writers. Like they're supposed to be critical of their own societies. Then along comes the so-called minority writer, and the minority writer is trapped in a number of very contradictory circumstances. Number one, as you said, we are expected to only talk about our own group, our own culture. That's our territory, right? So I'm Vietnamese. I'm supposed to be able to talk about the Vietnamese people, the Vietnam War, and so on. But the expectation is that I just talk about that, and that I translate, as you said, and explain things and serve as an ambassador and all of that kind of thing. But once the minority writer steps out of that and then starts to criticize the society that he or she or they live in, let's say the United States, then I or us or we have transgressed the boundaries that we're expected to stay behind. It's okay to talk about us. It's not okay to talk about dominant American society. And I thought, well, why is there that expectation put upon us? Why can't I do everything that white writers, for example, can do? And so that, I think, is a psychological barrier that a lot of so-called minority writers may have a hard time, number one, recognizing, and number two, overcoming. And so it's an important point in these novels to be as critical of French society and American society as Vietnamese society as well. And so I think that is discomforting for some American readers. I don't know about French readers yet. The translation is coming out in next month, I think. And so I'll find out what French readers think. But there are some American readers who do not like being criticized by people who they consider not to be American, which means white. So I do get a lot of messages from people. I got one yesterday, saying, go back to where you came from and that kind of thing. But the other point you brought up, that even for us within a Vietnamese community, the expectation is that we should just be talking about the good things about being Vietnamese. And that is based on this anxiety of being an outsider in American society or in some other country. This idea that we should put on a good face because we don't want other people, namely people of the so-called dominant culture, to think we do these other things like commit crimes, for example. And I understand that impulse, but again, the role of the artist is to portray the culture or the society in every aspect that it has. And I grew up in a Vietnamese community in which we did we did these things. We committed crimes, we had affairs, we drank too much, all these things. Not all of us, but some of us did that. And why shouldn't that be part of the material that we write about as artists? We know that this is what art is supposed to cover in general, but somehow as a so-called minority, we feel afraid of talking about these things. And so for me, one of the messages I have for writers and readers out there, is don't be afraid. Recognize what the fear is. Recognize why you may think that there are certain lines you can't cross. But part of what it means to be a writer is to have the courage, I think, to step over those lines that have been imposed on us and to have the full freedom to write exactly what needs to be said.
Thank you. And I'm sorry about, such messages that you get. And I think that's so terrible. I mean, that's why it proves that we have still so much work to do, So you must have had a great time, writing the Sympathizer, because I have a great time reading it. It's one of the very few books which I could pick up anytime, read and laugh out loud. It's extraordinary because the book deals with such painful subjects with humor and in such entertaining ways. So how did you deal with the pressure of writing The Committed after the success of the Sympathizer? Could you talk about the risk you took in writing The Committed, because you have invented some pretty unique storytelling techniques in this second novel? Instead of being safe and using the way of the trademark way of the prose in the Sympathizer, but you have gone beyond that, and you have shown us some really unique ways of storytelling. So I'm really curious to know.
I think as well as I do that a novelist's life, a writer's life in general, is mired in all kinds of self-doubt and lack of confidence, or maybe just me, but I'm always wrestling with self-doubt and lack of confidence and all of that. But in writing the Sympathizer, I made a very deliberate choice that, again, I was writing this novel for me. I wasn't going to worry about what anybody else thought. It was enormously liberating to do that. And then I wrote the novel, and as it turned out, it had a lot of success. I got very lucky, and it won the Pulitzer Prize and all of that. And so that left me with a choice when I started to write the sequel, which is, will all this success trap me or liberate me, right? And what I mean by trapping is that I could feel very beholden to what the novel already accomplished, the Sympathizer already accomplished, and feel like I have to do more of the same, like try to seek out more of the same acclaim and success and all of that. And I thought, well, I already won a Pulitzer Prize, and why do I need another one? So I should feel liberated by the success of this first novel and do whatever I want to do with the second novel, just as I felt like I could do whatever I wanted to do in the first novel. So that's the tack that I took. And I felt that the odds of The Committed being as successful as the Sympathizer were really, really low. And so why not just accept that and not worry about what critics think, what readers think, do what felt right to me aesthetically and politically in the second novel. And the way that I also dealt with this is that with the Sympathizer, as a first-time novelist, I read every single review of the novel, from professional reviewers in the big newspapers and magazines to every single review online on people on Amazon.com and Goodreads. And I thought, I cannot do this for The Committed, because then I would just feel beholden to every single person's opinion. And that's not the way I think one should be, or not for me personally, as an artist or as a writer. So I've read only a handful of reviews, and that's only because my agent or editor insisted I read these particular reviews. But otherwise, I have not read anything online or in print or anything like that, because I don't want to know. I don't want to know what readers and critics think of this second novel. I don't care if they like it or don't like it. But if I see these reviews or comments, I do care, because I'm a human being. Like, oh God, they did like it or they didn't like it. Either way, it's bad, because if they didn't like it, I'll feel bad. And if they did like it, my ego, which is already enormous, will get so big, it will just blow up, right? So it's much better for me to ignore what people think about this second novel. There's a third novel that will finish the trilogy, and I have to keep on with that mindset. Each novel is going to be unique. Each novel is not a repetition of the previous one. Each novel is designed to address a different stage in the captain's life, his psychology, and all of that kind of thing. So each one will have to be a little bit different than the one that came before.
I love The Committed, and people don't need to read the Sympathizer to read The Committed, because it's so unique, and I think the things that you've done, are just so brilliant, because they challenge us as readers as well to accept that the captain or Bozang or no name, he's very disturbed, he's very traumatized. So you have shown his trauma very well in this novel, and this novel is really innovative, and I love the way that you have shown your creative side, that you have broken apart of, you've broken away of the expectations of the pressures and write really freely, a really memorable novel. So the third novel in this series is called the Unfinished, right? Have you started it? And if you name it the Unfinished, I mean, so will you continue to write another one?
Well, I think I've plotted about 3/4 of the Unfinished, and I already know that it's going to be unfinished because, in a sense, I mean, the story for our narrator, the captain, will be finished. But the issues that the trilogy raises around war, colonialism, politics, all of that kind of thing, that is unfinished. That, if we imagine, for example, that we need a better world, however we choose to define that, that project is going to be unfinished for most of us in our lifetimes. And for me as a writer, I believe in art, but I also believe in politics, and I believe the two things can overlap. And for me, they should overlap. And in that sense, that is an unfinished project that we, in my imagination, there's so many more things that people, that societies still need to accomplish to deliver justice to all the people on this planet. And it's not going to happen in your lifetime or mine. That doesn't mean we should give up on that. We should be committed, as the second novel says, to this longer project in which each of us can contribute in some small way. And for each of us, it's going to be unfinished. That's why the title is the way that it is. I do think that there will be a way that the trilogy finishes the captain's story, brings that arc to an end, but it will also open up new possibilities. So would there be a fourth novel that takes up some of those new possibilities with a different person? I don't know. I'm not going to say, but the trilogy will finish the captain's story.
So I'm curious about your writing technique. So do you always plot everything in advance? So how did you write the Sympathizer? Did you map out everything before you wrote, or?
Well, with the Sympathizer, because it's a thriller, I thought it would be important to know how it ends before I begin. So in that case, I did write an outline for it. It was only 2 pages. And the end, I thought, was not quite right, but I have to have a target to aim for. And it was true. I followed the outline pretty faithfully for 3/4 of the way through the book. And then I thought, oh, no, now I know what the real ending is. And the real ending emerges from the psychology of our captain, and that was fine. So there's a combination of, for me in that novel, of outlining and then trusting my instincts that they'll deliver me where I need to go. The Committed, I had 50 pages, single space of material, outlines, character plot, sketches, themes, and all that kind of thing. It was a very different process for writing that book, and then it was really a disruptive process. In the Sympathizer, no one knew who I was. I could write the novel in 2 years undisturbed. In the Committed, I had to deal with so much publicity, et cetera, et cetera. It took me 4 years to write that novel instead. And then with I just finished a book, actually, a nonfiction book, which I wrote in about a year, based upon all the speeches and essays that I've given. And in that process, there was no outline. In that process, it's a nonfiction book that's partly memoir. I just gushed on the page. I just followed the emotional instincts that were in me. I mean, so the point here is that I think for me, every book is different. I mean, there's always some kind of combination of outlining, instinct, themes, all these things, but how each one works out in the end is just unique to that book, partly because of where I am at a particular moment in my life.
Oh, that's amazing to hear, and I cannot wait to read the Unfinished. And I mean, I'm really, you are an incredible nonfiction writer. I have really loved and felt empowered by your essays. For example, I was really moved by the recent essay, one of the recent essays you wrote on the New York Times about, the support which is needed for Afghan refugees. And you said our obligation to help Afghans in moral danger immortal danger extends beyond the present moment and well into the years ahead. Could you explain to the audience here today about this obligation, and also tell us a little bit more about your nonfiction book, because it sounds incredible?
Well, I think that talking specifically about the war in Afghanistan and the production of Afghan refugees, production sounds terrible, but just the creation of hundreds of thousands of Afghan refugees. I speak as myself, as someone who was and is a Vietnamese refugee. I mean, I was a Vietnamese refugee. I'm obviously no longer a refugee now. If you look at my backdrop, I mean, I'm clearly gone from refugee to bourgeoisie, but I feel like I've never forgotten what it means to be a refugee. I think about the fact that soldiers who have gone to war, they become veterans after they leave their service. They never stop being veterans. They never stop remembering what happened during the war that was so fundamental to them. And I think for refugees, it's very much the same thing. We too have been shaped by war. Our stories are war stories, even if we've not been in the military or soldiers and the like. So I still feel like my refugee experience shapes me, which gives me, I think, some capacity to empathize deeply with what the Afghan people are going through, especially people who have become refugees. And then I'm also an American. I'm an American citizen. I'm responsible for what this country does. You know, there's a limit to what each of us as American citizens can do, but we are a part of this society. We pay our taxes, we vote, we do or do not protest, et cetera, et cetera. So the United States is an enormous military industrial complex that is, in my mind, an empire, exerts its power all over the world, does various things that from the American perspective are legitimate, and from the perspective of people in other countries, oftentimes not so legitimate. You know, Americans feel that it is their or our God-given right to engage in drone strikes and to interfere in other countries, and that other countries, the people of other countries, should simply accept that. You know, and I just have, I find that impossible to accept myself, that if I was on the receiving end of an American drone strike that killed my family, that killed my children, I would not be accepting of this American narrative about the legitimacy of American power. So all that being said, the United States, in my opinion, intervened in Afghanistan in ways that were really destructive and unnecessary, and created the conditions both for the Taliban to reemerge and for the Taliban to succeed. And it's too complex to get into here about why that's the case. But nevertheless, I think the United States owes an enormous debt to the Afghan people, and that that's the least that we can do to help out the refugee populations. So I've been thinking about these issues for a long time, given a lot of talks, written a lot of essays, talking about my refugee experience and the experience of other refugees. And so it just felt that, you know, writing autobiographically was something that I never wanted to do, but it's something that I did undertake in the last few years. And for me, writing this nonfiction book, which is part memoir and part cultural criticism, has been important for me to work out a lot of emotional issues of my own history. I don't see therapists, for example, you know, but I work out my stuff through writing. But then also to connect to other people's circumstances, other wars, other refugee circumstances. And I finished writing this book around the time of the Fall of Kabul. And so the penultimate chapter in this book, Seek Memory, is a chapter about the Fall of Kabul and the final acts that the United States undertook in terms of evacuating Afghan refugees and also committing a drone strike that killed 10 innocent Afghan civilians. And to me, these are all part of the same historical narrative. You know, the United States did rescue tens of thousands of Afghan people, and it killed tens of thousands of Afghan people. It's all one and the same. And neither one, I mean, the rescue of Afghan civilians would not have been needed without the war that the United States undertook. So the nonfiction book is a way of talking about me, but also gesturing at how the issues that have shaped me are also the issues that are completely wrapped up in the United States and the exercise of American power.
You know, your words remind me about, you know, the time when I was a small girl, And I was standing in the middle of my village looking at the destruction around me, at the people who had lost their family members or their arms and legs. And as a little girl, I told myself, the human race would not be so stupid as to wage another war. Just look at the devastation. Just look at the cost. And growing up, I realized that I was very naive, you know, and like as humans, we always find excuses to start wars and armed conflicts. So what do you think? I mean, is there any hope for peace? And what can writers do to promote peace?
That's a hard question. I stand on the side of peace and justice. I think these two things are completely interrelated. We can't have peace without justice. And I think that for writers, we are people who have the capacity to shape our own narratives. And it's up to each of us to make a decision. How much do we want to talk about peace and justice in the art that we create? And it's not easy to do so. Anybody who's a writer knows it's really hard just to tell a story, right? With all the various components that you need to master in order to make a story work. And then you want to add in peace and justice. And a lot of writers, I think, just don't want to deal with it. For me, though, it's something, this incorporation of peace and justice and social consciousness into literature is something that's always been a part of me ever since I wanted to become a writer. So my lifelong challenge has been to try to figure out how to talk about all these things in a work of art. And I'm inspired by the fact that there are writers who I admire, who I look up to, who have done these kinds of things simultaneously. They have been both artistic to the highest degree, and they've been politically and socially committed to peace and justice at the highest degree as well. So it's possible. It's just hard to do. And people, it's hard for me to believe this, but people look up to writers. You know, I think I'm an idiot, but they're like, people, oh yeah, we care about your opinion, and you know, what you say is important and all that. And I think, well, that's a huge responsibility. But it's one I take, you know, pretty seriously, that people listen to what writers say, even in a world like today, where most people would rather be listening to music and watching movies and watching TV shows. There's still an enormous amount of respect accorded to the book, to literature, to the written word, and to the writer. And so writers who undertake this task of using their talent to say something meaningful about peace, justice, all these various important issues, you know, they have the capacity to influence people and to shape people's imaginations. So that's what we need to do. That's our possibility. And at the same time, we have to be humble, right? Because the reality of it is that even a bad TV show will get millions of viewers, and a popular novel might be lucky to get hundreds of thousands of readers. So there is an element of scale there, but nevertheless, each of us is obligated, I think, to do what we can within our constraints to try to move forward this narrative about the necessity for peace, justice, equality for everybody.
You know, thank you. And I'm really grateful for the work that you do as an activist, as a spokesperson for Asian Americans, for refugees, for minority writers. You do so much for so many other people, and you are, you know, an active parent of two wonderful small children. So my question is, how do you manage to have fun while doing all of these serious jobs? And how do you ensure your writing time? Do you have a writing routine?
You know, I grew up in a very devout Catholic family with very hardworking parents who never had any fun. So that's like, I'm okay with not having fun most of the time. You know, most of my life, I think, is work. And now, you know, I have kids, as you say, and they eat up all my extra time for the most part. So I think that number one, I'm actually pretty decent at time management. Number two, I'm lucky that I have enough money to pay for people to help me in a number of different ways, including nannies for the children and a lot of research assistants to help me with the professional life and everything like that. So for me, it's always been the case that when I had very few resources, I just worked a lot. So for example, when I am a professor, but you know, before the success, I would just be a professor during the day, and I would write fiction at night. That was my entire life. I was lucky to have a partner who was very understanding of this. And then when I became more successful, then I could use some of that money to buy time so that I could still write. So I think each of us has to figure out the right balance about all these kinds of issues. But I think in general, for people who become writers, for most of us who don't have independent wealth to start off with and who have to make a living in other ways, we're all sort of working 2 jobs. That's one of the challenges of being a writer. 3 jobs if you count being a parent. So I sympathize with all the writers out there who are faced with these circumstances and who have not yet gotten the financial resources to help them out. I've been there, so I think I know what you're going through. And then for the writing routine, it's, I think some people say you should write every day, and I don't write every day. So if you're not writing every day, don't knock yourself out. I don't think that's the crucial element for being a writer. What I do believe is that in order to become a writer and to be a writer, you do have to write a lot. And the only issue is that you just have to do it over a certain amount of time. So if the magic figure is 10,000 hours, and I think for me, it really did take about 10,000 hours of sitting at a desk, writing and researching in order to become a writer. I didn't do it every day, but I did it over 20 years or so. And so if you're that kind of a person, if you can shut out all the noise for a while, sit at your desk or wherever it is that you write and do a certain number of hours over a certain amount of time, you can become a writer. Right. And so your routine doesn't matter. For me, I write in the morning. That's the best time. But if I have to write at night, I will. If I have to write in the weekends, I will. And so we just got to get it done within the constraints that we have. And if we can do that, if you can do that, you can become a writer in 20 years or 30 years or 40 years. Or if you're super talented, and I hate you if you are, you can do it in 10 years or 5 years. Who knows? But really, the only secret there, I think, for the writing routine is just to make sure that you eventually do those hours.
So one of the most, I have admired you a lot, for the things that you have done for other writers. So you founded the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network, DVAN, and is the host of the very popular Accented Dialogues in the Diaspora series. Could you tell the audience about DVAN, Accented, and how people can participate and can help with your mission?
Sure. I think for me, it was the idea of being a writer has always been important. And, for a writer, for most of us, being a writer simply means being alone. You sit in a room and you write. But the idea of artistic community has always also been very important to me. That, part of my social justice mission is this idea that it's also important to build organizations, to build movements, and that literature doesn't actually exist in isolation from the rest of society. Now, the writer in the task of writing may be alone, but literature itself is engaged with the rest of the world. And that's especially true for those of us who happen to be so-called minority writers. Like in my case, I think that, the literature that I was able to write would not have been possible without preceding generations of other writers of color, Black writers, Asian American writers, who over decades had already established a context for someone like me to emerge. And that these other generations of writers wouldn't have been possible without the civil rights movement, the Asian American movement, and so on. So literature is always interacting with social and political circumstances. So when I was in college, it was very important for me as a Vietnamese American and as an Asian American to try to build a Vietnamese American artistic community, because I could look around in the 90s and think there are so few of us out there, not very many writers, not very many artists, and we should be building a community to support each other and to enable each other. And so that's what we did. We started an organization, my fellow Vietnamese Americans and I, that eventually became the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network. It has origins as the grassroots activist work of some community people and some students. And now, some 25, 30 years later, it is an organization that has a board, it has advisors, it raises funds, it puts on programs of the kinds that you mentioned. And what it does is to let other Vietnamese and Vietnamese diasporic and Vietnamese American artists and writers know they're not alone. They have residencies, they have conferences, they can go and watch this show called Accented online and see the latest and the greatest in Vietnamese artistic accomplishments. And I think that's enormously empowering to know that you're not alone, because I felt like I was alone when I was in college, or I felt like there was very few people who were like me. And now, for example, this season of Accented, as I'm plotting out the shows and everything, I just realized we have like 8 books coming out or have come out or will come out by Vietnamese American writers. I'm not even talking about the rest of the Vietnamese diaspora, just Vietnamese American writers within the space of a year. 8 books, poetry, fiction, nonfiction. That's incredible. Because in the 90s, we didn't have, I don't think we had 8 books total. And here in 1 year, 8 books, and there are probably others that I don't even know about that might still be coming out. So we built this together as a community, and we should be trying to develop the circumstances to let other young writers and artists emerge as well. And I take this very seriously because, like, I am now old, okay? So people look at me as like, I'm the gatekeeper, or I am of this generation that has the power to help determine other people's fates. And I don't want to be the gatekeeper. I want to like destroy the gate. I want to create the conditions, or help create the conditions, where we have all these young writers who are doing all kinds of crazy things that I could never imagine myself. Like, the last thing I want to do is reproduce myself. I want to see writers and artists who are doing their own unique thing. And so that's what the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network is about, creating those circumstances, encouraging these kinds of idiosyncratic, eccentric, unique voices out there to come out. You can go to dvan.org and check out what we're doing. You can contribute financially. Small sums are fine. If you want to become a lifetime member, that's $1,000 US, and I am donating $25,000 to match 25 lifetime members. So if you have it in your pocketbook and in your heart, become a lifetime member, I'll match your $1,000.
You know, Divan changed my life. Divan enabled me to become the writer who I am today. So thank you. And I hope you will support Divan and read all the books written by Professor Viet Thanh Nguyen, because, these are must-read books. And I sincerely thank you, Professor, for the honor of the conversation today. I have learned a lot from you. And by the way, you are young. You are not old at all. So I expect a lot more books from you, more essays, more conversations from you. So thank you so much for this, for a great time. And thank you to those who have been with us today. I appreciate your time and support, and thank you for supporting the festival. And I hope you will check out the festival's many other events and conversations. And I hope to see you in real life in a, in-person festival very soon, because the Ubud Writers and Readers Festivals is one of the best festivals out there. And I had the opportunity to be there a few years ago, and I had a great time. And I can't wait to be back in Bali. And Viet, maybe you and I can go to Bali together for a festival there. That would be amazing.
I would love to. It was such a pleasure talking to you, Que Mai. I really wish I was in Bali for this, but one day we'll make it happen.
Yes. Thank you, everyone. Take care.